Naomi had been through far too much in far too short a time, until confusion was no longer a temporary state, but a thick fog clinging to her mind. While Anita was fighting illness, while Nicole, the woman Naomi had always viewed as the unshakable pillar of their family, was also swaying under the weight of her own private pain, Naomi was being dragged into a new vortex, the suffocating suspense of her own BRCA test results. All it would take was one positive, and everything in Naomi's life would shift in a way that could never be undone. It wasn't just a medical result. It was a sentence hanging in midair, a ruthless reminder that sometimes the body betrays you even when you've lived by the rules, lived with grace, lived up to every expectation your family ever carved into you. And because she was a Dupree, Naomi couldn't easily allow herself to break. Duprees weren't raised to believe in fate. They were raised to believe in power, in control, in bending the world until it obeyed. But this time, Naomi couldn't control a single thing. She couldn't command the test to come back harmless, and she couldn't force her body to stay quiet, while the panic inside her grew sharper by the day. On the outside, Naomi still fought to maintain calm, was an instinct for survival, but on the inside, she was beginning to recognize the fracture spreading through her pride. The thoughts looped endlessly, like an obsessive soundtrack she couldn't shut off. What if she was positive? What if her life from this point forward became a chain of new fears? What if the future she had always assumed would be fine was actually so fragile that one sheet of paper could make it collapse? Naomi wasn't only afraid of illness. She was afraid of losing ownership of her own life. She was afraid of living in a house drenched in luxury light, while her mind kept seeing darkness. And more than anything, she was afraid of becoming another version of the women in her family, women so strong they seemed unkillable, only to be quietly broken from the inside by pains no one could see. While Naomi fought not to shatter, Jacob became an almost unbearable pressure. He didn't mean to suffocate her, but the way he looked at the future with desperation and urgency turned Naomi into the one person who had to carry every decision. Jacob wanted an answer. Jacob wanted Naomi to be strong. Jacob wanted her to choose immediately, right now, as if her hesitation were a threat. The tension between them wasn't loud or obvious. It was heavy, dense, the kind that made Naomi feel like she was standing beneath a hydraulic press every time they were close. The more Jacob pushed, the more Naomi felt fear transforming into anger. And that anger was more dangerous than anything, because Naomi wasn't the kind of woman who only expressed rage with words. She expressed it with actions, with coldness, with a shutdown so complete that no one could reach her. Naomi understood that Jacob was panicking in his own way. He wasn't from the Dupree world. He hadn't been raised with the rule that weakness was unacceptable. Jacob could show fear more openly, more directly, but that only made Naomi feel like she had even less room to breathe. She didn't want to become the person responsible for guaranteeing Jacob's sense of safety when she couldn't even guarantee her own. Naomi knew they were standing at a breaking point. One wrong touch, one sentence at the wrong time, one result as bad as her instincts predicted, and everything would explode into a disaster no one could stop. And Naomi's fear didn't end there. She also had to face another truth growing inside her, something she had never mentally prepared herself to carry: an unplanned pregnancy. It arrived like a brutal strike, like fate's cruel joke, at the exact moment Naomi was standing on the fragile edge between life and inherited obsession. If Naomi had once believed she could control everything, her career, her image, her future, even other people's emotions, now she was trapped in a situation with no simple escape. That baby hadn't been part of any plan. It appeared like a question mark carved into her life, forcing Naomi to choose between a future she hadn't even had time to shape and a present terror tightening around her day by day. The most painful part was that Naomi already knew the answer waiting for her in the shadows. In this context, her choice felt almost predetermined. She couldn't carry a new life into a battle she wasn't even sure she could win. She could see the cruel possibility with terrifying clarity. If the BRCA result was positive, Naomi would be shoved into merciless decisions about her health, her body, and the risks her family had already lived through. She would be forced into sterile conversations with doctors, into choices no one wants to make, into the reality that survival can sometimes become a series of brutal compromises. And through all of it, she didn't know she could protect that baby, and she didn't know she even had the right to selfishly keep it. Naomi fell into a state of shock and numbness, as if her entire life had been ripped apart and thrown across the floor, demanding she put it back together, while her hands trembled too much to hold anything steady. Jacob, meanwhile, had never been ready for this kind of blow. For him, the baby wasn't just an unexpected event. It was hope. It was the rare light he could cling to when everything around them felt too dark. Jacob had wanted to be a father in a way Naomi hadn't even fully imagined, and because of that, when Naomi was forced to confront the possibility that she might have to let the baby go, Jacob was thrown straight into the abyss. He wasn't only grieving a loss, he was unraveling from the feeling of having his future stolen, his right to hope ripped away. A part of him collapsed before it ever had the chance to exist, and that made the distance between him and Naomi no longer the distance of a small misunderstanding, but a life or death gulf where each of them felt isolated in the most merciless way. Naomi didn't want to become the villain in Jacob's eyes, but she also couldn't become a mother who sacrificed everything just to hold on to something she wasn't sure she could protect. She began to understand why depraved women were haunted by control, because only by controlling everything did they feel they could survive. But Naomi's life no longer obeyed any rule. It was forcing her to grow up or a way no one in her family had ever taught her. It was pushing her into a decision with no right answer, only the answer that hurt less. And Naomi hated that. She hated helplessness. She hated her body becoming a battlefield. She hated Jacob turning love into pressure, without even meaning to. And she hated herself for not being strong enough to save everyone. The air between Naomi and Jacob thickened until it felt like a room running out of oxygen. Every time they were close, a sentence, not yet spoken, was enough to wound the other. Every glance carried questions no one dared to ask. Every silence felt like an accusation. Naomi could feel that if she didn't escape this pressure, she would detonate. And Jacob was starting to look like a man clinging to his last hope, only that hope was slipping through his fingers, inch by inch. They loved each other, but love was no longer strong enough to keep them upright when fear and survival wedged themselves between them. And then everything would reach its peak, a moment Naomi had to face the test results. That paper wouldn't just decide her medical status, it would decide how she saw her future. It would decide whether Naomi walked out of this room with enough faith to keep living, or as someone forced to begin a new war inside her own body. Jacob might have believed he was prepared for any outcome, but the truth was he wasn't prepared for Naomi to change. Naomi might have believed she was strong enough to control her emotions, but the truth was she was standing before a moment where one word, positive, could bring her entire life crashing down. And when Naomi finally opened the envelope, her hands shook so violently she could barely hold the paper. Her breath locked inside her chest. Her eyes suddenly stopped, frozen. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. But that silence was more terrifying than any scream, because Jacob looked at Naomi's face and understood instantly. Something had happened. Something that would never allow them to go back to who they used to be. And in the exact moment Jacob stepped closer, Naomi instinctively stepped back, as if she was afraid of her own future. Then her phone vibrated. A medical notification lit up the screen, cold and unmistakably clear, like the final blade piercing what little piece she had left. The results had been fully updated.